But it is worth looking at the historical context because undoubtedly it influences the work. And one of the ways this happens, and this is Ken Urban positing this in his article An Ethics of Catastrophe, one of the ways it happens is to claim, as Kane's agent Mel Kenyon did, that I'm paraphrasing, you can't, or rather, it wouldn't be proper or appropriate to stage something about war, for example, if war wasn't happening. The stage, in other words, should be a space in which the political climate is accurately represented. She says, there's no point in mimicking the form of resolution and certainty in a time of complete uncertainty. One of the problems of this kind of approach of Urban's, and the approach wherein he attributes the quality and content of the play to the historical context of the time, is that it implies that the young writers, and remember Kane was 23 at the time, united by a historical movement and a set of common enemies, he says, are directed as humans by events external to them, that their actions are only a consequence of events external. So the public and not those in their own heads, so the intimately private. 4.48 Psychosis was perceived by Kenyon to be a suicide note, and Urban does address that the play is the product of a singular, albeit divided, self. So there is some acknowledgement of the origin or the roots of the work as stemming from the psyche, that internal private space. And I'll get onto the relation between the public and private later. So Urban says, this political backdrop feeds into the aesthetic sensibilities of the playwriting 20-nothings and provides the spark for their theatrical innovations. And he goes on to say that one of the ways in which the dialectical reconciliation may be achieved is through conversation, and suggests the dramatic form best suited for this forum of ideas was, hands down, a realistic linear narrative. But of course that isn't what we're seeing in Blasted. What we're seeing is an augmented reality, certainly as the play progresses. And again, to go back to Mel Kenyon, it's important definitely that we see something on stage that's grounded in reality without actually being reality. But I'd like to pick up on that point about conversation, because I think language is significant in the play, and it's something that Sarah Ablett talks about in her essay Approaching Objection in Sarah Kane's Blasted. And her argument is that what we're presented with in Blasted is a move from the symbolic order of language to the semiotic, that is a state predating language. So, because the play has moved from what she calls the social conventions of a domestic play to surreal imagery, we're seeing a staged regression from the symbolic to the semiotic. One of the most significant questions for me is, where do Kate and Ian figure in this framework? The argument Ablett puts forward presupposes that a fully fledged human adult should be situated in the symbolic, wherein the structure of use of language is deployed mostly seamlessly. And for most people this is accurate. That transition is made, you go from being into meaning, not without injury, but eventually successfully. And what it does is allow us to live amongst others and function like everyone else. Ablett writes that Blasted can be regarded as a theatrical instantiation of abjection being a state of crisis and instability, wherein the border or boundaries between self and other and between inside and outside are troubled or about to be subjected to some kind of trauma. For me, this comes back to Freud and Lacan, and without getting into the intricacies of their arguments and commentary on ego formation and so on, one of the things that I recalled reading Ablett's article was specifically the threatened undoing of the ego. And of course everything does threaten to undo it. I think it was Freud who spoke of the ego in terms of it being a fortress, in the sense that it functions trying to defend itself against such attacks. That imagery of the fortress is particularly interesting to me when considering Blasted, because we can see the hotel room as representing the ego, so that fortress, which is then of course blasted apart. So what we should be seeing then, and I think what we are seeing, and this is Sarah Ablett's argument too, is a complete fall into pieces of structure and identity. So we do witness the undoing, so to speak, of Kate and Ian. We've moved from the conventions of realism into something surreal and absurd, certainly at the beginning of scene 2 and continuing till the end. Something perhaps more akin to Beckett's Waiting for Godot or Pinter's The Birthday Party, where the intruder figures as a disruptive force. In all three plays, what we see is boundaries crossed. We see a transgression of the norm and of order and stability. So the soldier comes in both senses of the word, where he was outside of the hotel walls, he's now inside, and what was inside him is now outside. So there's a definite blurring of lines. That container of and boundary of brick or skin is proved to be permeable, and it won't protect you. That thing that is other, that is not you, that is apart from you, is right here now. So there's that transgression of boundaries. Perhaps the outsider is so terrifying not so much because he's other and not me, but because of his ability or because of the ease with which he could come inside. Because when he does transgress that border and he steps over that line demarcating me from you, inside from outside, I then have to identify afresh who I am, because who am I has been thrown into question. Perhaps this accounts for the disembodied feeling you can experience while being raped, this feeling of not really being there. Obviously, it's a mechanism of defense and protection, but what it shields a victim from is him or herself and their sense of themselves, their ego. Because to ask, who am I, now I am changed, can be very painful. So, the ego, that fortress, crumbles and an invasion takes place. This also has to do with the lack of clear distinction between public and private. I know in the seminar, in the group that I was sat with, the two were spoken about as though they could only be separate, in a kind of either or way. I don't think it's so simple as that, as I've said. Kate and Ian then. Kate is particularly interesting here because she has a stutter, which is emphasised whenever she's under stress, it says in the text. I think, in a way, speech itself can be seen as abject, since in order for us to hear it and then interpret it, it has to occupy that space between inside and outside, between you and me. I don't know if we're supposed to read Kate's stutter as evidence of the failure of language to convey what we mean to say, because that's the case anyway. If I speak to you in full sentences, I'm still restricted by language. I can only say what language allows me to say. But I think what we can safely say is that it represents a move backwards in time to the semiotic. Albert quotes Louis Ferdinand Céline saying, "When even the limit between inside and outside becomes uncertain, the narrative is what is challenged first. If it continues, nevertheless, its makeup changes, its linearity is shattered, it proceeds in flashes, enigmas, shortcuts, incompletion, tangles, and cuts." And I think this crisis of language is what we're witnessing take place in Kate. Ablett continues, quoting Christopher now. Semiotic functioning embraces the less visible role of tone, gesture, and rhythm. So we might think again about the breakdown of language. There's so much swearing between them, and so much of their speech is fragmented. Then she moves on to quote Kane again, saying that the play collapses into one of Kate's fainting fits. And this, she notes, is the embodiment of abjection. So there's the question of liminality, and how does that liminality get expressed? How do you go about dramatising it? Where words fail, and as we've seen, they necessarily will, I think that what is physical can be read in compensation for the inadequacy of speech. So there's lots of tears and piss and common blood. Ian later tries to clean up his own shit with a newspaper, which I thought was interesting given that he calls himself a journalist, that words fail to contain and to hold. They become, I guess if we're drawing comparisons between symbolic and semiotic, they become like the bricks in skin I mentioned earlier, kind of porous. So it's a vision that looks pretty bleak. I asked earlier how we should consider Kate and Ian in the equation of the symbolic and semiotic, and I talked mostly about Kate, but I'd like to bring the focus round to Ian, not least because I'm not sure they can really be separated. At times the pair merges as a kind of a physical illusion. Ian at one point says, "We're one, yes." Another word for this merging and transgression of boundaries, Sean Carney in his article The Tragedy of History in Sarah Kane's Blasted, he quotes Terry Eagleton as referring to history, not in reference to past events, but what he calls the possibility of some redemptive meaning emerging out of those events in the future. He then quotes E.H. Carr as saying, "It is something incomplete and in the process of becoming, something in the future towards which we move, which begins to take shape only as we move towards it." Which to me recalled Approaching Objection, where Ablett says, "The depiction of the semiotic can therefore only be approached." And to that I would add, though it's probably obvious, you can never get hold of it. I think that's what's implied there. So what of approaching then? Approaching objection. Where are we if we're neither here nor there? We certainly see the severity of this dilemma and some of its implications staged in Blasted. Concerning this in-between state, Ian probably suffers the most. He's both dead and somehow still alive, and neither simultaneously. And of course that death, I think, should be read as symbolic, and what we do when we accept that reading, when we go with it, is we rid death of its power to stop us from living. I mean, I don't think anyone is stopped by death. You know, I don't mean real people, but characters in absurdist plays. I mentioned Waiting for Godot earlier, and I'm not sure how many of Beckett's plays we could say of the characters. Oh, you know, he's living his life, is he? You know, so what's my point? Carney writes that the absolute, so history, cannot be achieved, and says of Blasted that it shows an awareness of history as the experience of the impossible. He goes on to say, this performance of mortality is an attempt to render present on the stage that which always defies representation. And I thought back to Ken Urban's article where he quotes Kane as saying, if you're saying you can't represent something, you are saying you can't talk about it, you are denying its existence. Then when I think about the representation of death and the impossibility of it, and Sean Carney does refer to that liminal state as being the impossible image, you've staged not only a dilemma but a paradox of sorts. And I'm also thinking, if you take away the possibility of death, don't you also take away the possibility of life? I mean, you know, if the two can't be separated, and if Ian is living this liminal existence, which I do think he is. So the question was, where are we? Where is Ian, rather? I want to conclude by saying that what we're seeing in the process we're seeing in Ian's character is a return to being from meaning, so a move, as Ablett has argued, from the symbolic to the semiotic, back to what Kristeva calls the Cora, and I'll be probably pronouncing that incorrectly, but briefly, the Cora being the stage 0 to 6 months in which you're pretty much a fucking mess. You're all feeling and desire and crying, it's chaos. Importantly though, during this stage you're unable to distinguish yourself from your mother, and it's through a relation with the abject that the baby comes eventually to be able to make that distinction. It's complicated for me because Kate is so often depicted as the mother, certainly when she's feeding him in the grave and when he's lying between her legs. And is this death of orgasm not also rebirth? Sean Carney makes the link here between jouissance and the end of the self, which is for Ian the mark of death. But it's possible to see how close both life and death are, and how the two are, I think, inseparable. So Ian becomes again, or returns to being, this bundle of drives. The baby's grave, I think, is also his. This to me recalls Beckett's they give birth astride a grave, the light gleams an instant, then it's gone once more. Certainly the repetition of in Blasted of darkness, light, 8 times during this seeming unending process suggests perhaps the move from the symbolic to the semiotic is not final or conclusive, but these states are something that can be, certainly in Ian's case, something that can be ricocheted between. So when we look at the blurring, or maybe the complete blasting apart of concrete parameters between Ian and Kate, life and death being a meaning, it becomes not too absurd to propose that Ian is at once the mother and the baby, or maybe both and neither. So that in occupying the grave, you have to remember there are roots in the ground. There's that absolute determination, consciously or otherwise, to have that umbilical connection re-established, to start again and to die.